The roar of explosions shook the ground. Sirens screamed as RAF crewmen sprinted through darkness toward burning wreckage. Bomb craters marred the landscape, and twisted metal glowed in the firelight. On the far side of the airfield, medics dragged a barely conscious gunner from a shattered cockpit. His face was coated in blood, his flight suit torn by shrapnel. Overhead, the drone of departing German bombers faded, leaving only the crackle of flames and the raw stink of cordite. Air Marshal Harris clenched his jaw as he walked the shattered runway at dawn. Last night's German raid had hit the airfield's heart, torching 5 bombers and killing 18 men. The Luftwaffe's precision was uncanny. It was as if the attackers had read the blueprints, as if they had known every routine. Harris stared at the ruined planes with a cold, surgical anger. Something had to change. The enemy's eyes in the sky had to be blinded, or fooled. Beneath London's noisy streets, Colonel John Turner waited for Harris's call. He was not a man of uniformed heroics, but a master of shadows and secrets. The war he waged was not measured in shells or sorties, but in illusions, double bluffs, and psychological warfare. Turner's unit, Force Extrait, was an army of illusionists, engineers, artists, and defectors whose existence was denied by every government memo, and whose failures could never see the light of day. That morning his orders were simple and perilous. The next time they bomb us, it won't be our airfield. The plan took shape amid brittle nerves and mounting dread. The team would create an entire fake airfield. Wooden bombers, bogus barracks, painted tire tracks, so convincing it would draw a storm of enemy bombers. Every bolt, every shadow, every muddy footprint would have to fool the best German eyes in the sky. But if the Luftwaffe found the ruse, they would not just ignore it. They would adapt, hunt for the real bases, and next time, the price would be bloodier. Failure was not just career suicide for Turner. The Gestapo executed every double agent they caught. MI5 whispers hinted that a German mole was embedded somewhere on the project's supply lines. Every delivery was a risk. Every telegram was a potential leak. Turner assigned his new deputy, Flight Lieutenant Strangeways, not only to design the illusion, but to watch for sabotage at every step. On a rain-choked April night, Turner's heart nearly gave out. An urgent report landed on his desk. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane had veered off its usual route, circling the construction site twice. Was it a random deviation? Or had the Germans noticed flaws in the dummy layout? In the candlelit war room, Turner and Strangeways pored over intercepted Luftwaffe chatter. Sweating, Turner rehearsed a cover story. If the Germans ever deduced the truth, the entire deception unit would face interrogation, disgrace, perhaps even secret execution. Despite exhaustion, tempers, and the razor-edge fear of discovery, the work pressed on. The wooden Lancasters were rolled out under cover of darkness. Fake barracks were peppered with drying laundry. Hidden teams staged scenes for enemy cameras, pretending to refuel, polish, and inspect the plywood beasts. From above, the field looked alive, buzzing with activity, and invisible to all but the most skeptical. One cold dawn, Turner lingered at the edge of the fake runway, anxiety sour in his stomach. A coded message arrived from Bletchley Park. The Germans were planning a major night raid. They had marked Turner's illusion as a vital strategic target. Turner struggled to suppress a manic grin and a tremor of panic. Had their performance convinced the enemy, or was it all a trap for the deceivers themselves? As the sun broke over the fields of England, Turner's shadow stretched long over the plywood bombers, and he did not know if tomorrow's sunrise would bring fame or a court-martial. The fate of the entire operation, and perhaps hundreds of real airmen, hung in the balance. The convoy of trucks arrived before dawn, their headlights extinguished, engines growling low. Flight Lieutenant David Strangeways stood in the rain-soaked field, clutching blueprints that were already disintegrating in the wet. Around him, 70 men waited in silence, their faces invisible in the darkness. They were carpenters, painters, theater set designers, and criminals recruited from military prisons. Some had built stages for West End productions. Others had forged documents for black market smugglers. Now they would forge an entire airfield. Strangeways unrolled the first blueprint across the hood of a truck, rainwater pooling on the paper. A sergeant leaned in, squinting. The design showed a Lancaster bomber, rendered in plywood and canvas. Exact dimensions, correct tail markings, even the proper angle of the gun turrets. The sergeant looked up with undisguised skepticism. "Sir, this will never fool anyone up close." Strangeways met his eyes. "It does not need to fool anyone up close. It needs to fool a camera at 20,000 feet, traveling 300 miles per hour." He tapped the blueprint. "Build it wrong, and real men die on real airfields because the Germans will know we are lying. The first wooden bomber took 6 days to construct, and it was a disaster. The wings sagged. The fuselage buckled in the wind. When a German reconnaissance plane passed overhead on the 7th day, Strangeways watched through binoculars as it circled twice, lingering. His stomach turned to ice. That night, he burned the first prototype and started again. The second attempt incorporated lessons learned from theater and cinema. The bombers were not solid structures, but lightweight frames covered in painted canvas, braced internally with tension wires like the rigging of a ship. From above, shadows and perspective created the illusion of three-dimensional metal. But there was a hidden trap. If the shadows painted on the canvas did not match the angle of the sun at the exact time German reconnaissance flights passed over, the aircraft would look flat, fake, deadly wrong. Strangeways studied Luftwaffe reconnaissance schedules captured by British intelligence. The Germans flew their photo runs at 1100 hours and 1600 hours, when the sun was high enough for clear images, but angled enough to show structural details. He calculated the shadow angles for those times, adjusted for the season and latitude, and painted each fake bomber accordingly. It was meticulous, obsessive work that left him sleepless and shaking with exhaustion. But the aircraft were only the beginning. A Luftwaffe defector, a former intelligence analyst who had fled to Britain after his family was murdered by the Gestapo, sat with Strangeways in a freezing Quonset hut and explained what German photo interpreters looked for. His name was Oscar, and he spoke in clipped, bitter sentences. They do not just see airplanes, they see life, tire tracks from fuel trucks, footpaths worn into the grass by ground crews, oil stains where mechanics work, laundry drying outside barracks, smoke from kitchens. If these details are missing, the analyst writes one word on the report: decoy. Strangeways felt his throat tighten. Every detail Oscar described would have to be fabricated, staged, maintained daily. He looked at the defector. What happens to analysts who miss a decoy? Oscar's face hardened. They are sent to the Eastern Front. If they miss 2, they are shot. The stakes were now horrifyingly clear. The Germans would scrutinize every pixel of every photograph because their lives depended on it. One inconsistency, one implausible detail, and the entire operation would collapse. The team worked with frantic precision. Fake tire tracks were created by dragging weighted wheels across the grass in patterns that matched refueling schedules. Oil stains were painted onto concrete, using mixtures that weathered correctly. Dummy laundry was hung on lines near fake barracks, rotated daily to simulate different crews. A kitchen chimney was rigged to produce smoke at mealtimes, using smoldering damp wood that created the right volume and color. The runway itself became an artistic masterpiece of controlled decay. Real runways showed tire scorch marks from breaking aircraft, patches where bomb damage had been repaired, and cracks from years of thermal expansion. Strangeways and his painters studied reconnaissance photos of genuine RAF airfields for 2 weeks, cataloging every imperfection. Then they recreated those patterns using paint, tar, and carefully applied weathering techniques borrowed from film studios. But one problem nearly destroyed everything. In late May, a German reconnaissance aircraft appeared without warning at dawn, hours before the scheduled flight time. The fake airfield was not prepared. Half the dummy bombers were still covered with tarps. No smoke rose from the kitchen. No vehicles moved on the access roads. Strangeways watched in horror as the plane circled, its camera pod glinting in the early light. He made a decision that could have ended his career. Within minutes, he had men running across the field in mechanics' coveralls, pulling tarps, starting small fires, even driving a real truck in circles to create fresh tire tracks. It was improvisation, chaos, desperation. When the reconnaissance plane finally departed, Strangeways collapsed against a fence post, his hands shaking uncontrollably. 3 days later, a decoded Luftwaffe transmission arrived from Bletchley Park. German intelligence had noted the new airfield and classified it as operational, high value, recommended for bombing. Strangeways read the message twice, relief and terror flooding through him in equal measure. They had passed the test. Now they would reap the consequences. The final element was the most dangerous: night lighting. Real airfields used specific lighting patterns for night operations. Runway edge lights, approach lights, perimeter lights, and the occasional vehicle headlight moving between buildings. The Germans photographed these patterns at dusk to confirm which airfields were active, but Turner refused to install real electrical systems. The power requirements would be enormous, the generators would need fuel, and the entire setup would create logistical traces that German intelligence might detect. Instead, Strangeways designed a system of oil lanterns, controlled fires, and carefully timed light signals that mimicked the appearance of an operational airfield from altitude. On the first test night, Strangeways stood in a field 3 miles away with binoculars, watching his fake airfield glow in the darkness. The lights flickered and danced, vehicles moved along roads, and the silhouettes of bombers sat in dispersal bays like sleeping predators. From this distance, it looked utterly real. He allowed himself a brief, grim smile. Then he saw it. A single light was out of position, too far south, breaking the pattern. A German analyst would notice. Strangeways sprinted back to the site, screaming orders, his heart hammering. The light was repositioned within minutes, but the error had been visible for nearly an hour. Had a reconnaissance plane passed over? Had a camera captured the mistake? For 2 days, Strangeways barely slept, waiting for confirmation that the deception had been compromised. None came. The fake airfield stood ready, a theatrical masterpiece designed to lure death from the skies. And somewhere over occupied Europe, Luftwaffe bomber crews were being briefed on their next target, a critical RAF installation that intelligence had confirmed was vital to the Allied war effort. They were coming, and when they arrived, they would find nothing but wood, paint, and fire. The photographs arrived at Luftwaffe Intelligence Headquarters in Saint-Omer, France, on a humid June morning in 1943. Major Klaus Steiner opened the leather case with practiced efficiency, sliding out the reconnaissance negatives and holding them up to the light. He had analyzed thousands of such images over 3 years of war. His eyes were trained to spot inconsistencies, deceptions, the subtle lies that British intelligence tried to plant. He had sent 4 junior analysts to the Eastern Front for missing decoys. He himself had nearly been executed for failing to identify a dummy fuel depot outside Dover. Steiner placed the first negative on the light box. An airfield. Dispersal bays holding what appeared to be Lancaster bombers. He reached for his magnifying loupe and began the meticulous process of verification. Wing shadows. Correct angle for the time of day. Tire marks on the runway. Consistent with heavy bomber operations. Oil stains near the maintenance hangars. Weathered, not fresh. He moved to the next image, taken from a different angle. The bombers were positioned naturally, not in the neat rows that characterized decoys. Ground crew vehicles were parked irregularly. Laundry hung outside barracks. Steiner felt a familiar tension in his chest. This looked real. Too real. The British were masters of deception, and every analyst knew that the most convincing lies were built on layers of perfect detail. He picked up his red grease pencil, ready to mark the images as suspected decoy, when he noticed something in the corner of one photograph. A man. Tiny, barely visible, but clearly a human figure walking between 2 buildings. Steiner's hand froze. Decoys did not have people. The British were meticulous about keeping personnel away from fake installations because a single human figure would confirm the site as genuine. He studied the figure more closely. The shadow was correct. The stride length was natural. This was not painted scenery or a mannequin. He set down the grease pencil and reached for his black one instead. Genuine target. High value. 3 days later, the photographs landed on the desk of Oberst Friedrich Hoffmann, Chief of Bomber Operations, Planning for Luftwaffe III. Hoffmann was a lean, haunted man who had lost 2 brothers on the Eastern Front, and most of his illusions about German invincibility somewhere over the burning wreckage of Stalingrad. He studied Steiner's analysis with weary skepticism. Every target the British wanted bombed was suspect. Every airfield could be a trap. But the intelligence reports were compelling. Radio intercepts suggested increased activity at this location. French resistance sources had reported seeing night flights in the area. Aerial reconnaissance had photographed the site 3 times over 2 weeks, and each time the details were consistent. Aircraft positions changed, vehicles moved. The base showed signs of active operations. Hoffmann's instinct screamed caution, but the evidence was overwhelming. He called Steiner into his office that evening. The major arrived with his analysis portfolio, shadows under his eyes from sleepless nights scrutinizing British deception. Hoffmann poured 2 glasses of schnapps and gestured for Steiner to sit. "Tell me the truth, Klaus. Is this real, or are we being played?" Steiner opened his portfolio and spread reconnaissance photos across Hoffman's desk. I have checked everything. Shadows, weathering patterns, tire tracks, oil stains. I have compared this site against 12 confirmed genuine RAF airfields. Every detail matches. There is vehicle activity consistent with refueling operations. There is laundry outside barracks, which means ground crews are living there. Most importantly, there are people visible in 3 separate images. Hoffman studied the photos in silence. The British are clever. They know we look for these details. Yes, sir. But to fake this level of consistency across multiple reconnaissance flights, over multiple weeks, with changing aircraft positions and human activity, would require more resources than simply building a real airfield. The British are stretched thin. They do not waste effort on elaborate theater when they need every resource for actual operations. Hoffman wanted to believe him. The Luftwaffe needed victories. Bomber crews needed targets that mattered. The war was turning against Germany, and every successful strike against RAF infrastructure bought time, bought leverage, bought hope. He looked at the photographs again, and this time he allowed himself to see what he wanted to see: a legitimate, high-value target that could be destroyed. Prepare the briefing. I want attack plans by tomorrow evening. The orders were issued on July 2nd. 60 Heinkel He-111 bombers from Kampfgeschwader 4 would conduct a maximum effort night raid on the newly identified RAF airfield. The operation would launch at 2200 hours on July 4th, with Pathfinder aircraft marking the target using flares. The raid would be supported by electronic countermeasures to jam British radar and diversionary attacks on other locations to split defensive resources. The briefing room at the bomber base was tense with anticipation. Flight crews studied reconnaissance photos pinned to the walls. Pilots memorized approach routes. Bombardiers calculated release points. Hauptmann Werner Brecht, a veteran pilot with 34 missions and a growing conviction that Germany was losing the war, stared at the target photos with unease that he could not articulate. Something felt wrong. The airfield looked too perfect, too inviting. Brecht had survived this long by trusting his instincts, and his instincts now whispered warnings that he could not explain to his superiors without sounding like a coward. He approached the intelligence officer after the briefing. These photos. How many reconnaissance flights confirmed this target? 3 flights over 2 weeks. Major Steiner personally verified the analysis. And what defenses can we expect? Light to moderate anti-aircraft batteries, possible night fighter patrols, but we are launching diversionary raids to draw them away. Brecht studied the photos one more time. Every rational calculation said this was a legitimate target. But rationality had failed repeatedly in this war, and the British had proven themselves masters of psychological warfare. He returned to his quarters that night and wrote a letter to his wife that he would never send. In it, he described his fear that the British had learned to think like Germans, to anticipate their logic, to build traps disguised as opportunities. On the afternoon of July 3rd, final preparations began. Bombers were fueled and armed. Crews attended last briefings. Meteorologists confirmed favorable weather conditions. Scattered clouds, no moon, visibility sufficient for Pathfinder flares, but poor enough to hinder British night fighters. Everything aligned for a successful strike. At Luftwaffe Intelligence Headquarters, Major Steiner stood at his office window, watching ground crews prepare the bombers. He held a glass of schnapps, but did not drink. A junior analyst had approached him that morning with a troubling observation. The British airfield's runway lighting patterns, visible in the latest dusk reconnaissance photos, appeared slightly irregular compared to standard RAF configurations. Steiner had dismissed the concern. Irregular did not mean fake. Real bases often deviated from standard patterns due to terrain, improvisation, or operational necessity. But now, watching the bombers being prepared, Steiner felt the weight of doubt. If he was wrong, 60 crews would die for nothing. If he was right, a crucial RAF installation would burn. He had made the decision. Now, he would live with the consequences. At 2100 hours on July 4th, engines roared to life. 60 Heinkel bombers rolled toward the runway, heavy with fuel and explosives. In the cockpits, pilots ran final checks. In the bellies, bombardiers armed their payloads. And in the cold night sky over England, British radar operators watched the formation assemble and begin its journey toward the target. The trap was closing. The radar screen glowed green in the darkness. Flight Lieutenant James Calloway leaned forward in his chair at the Chain Home Station in Norfolk, eyes locked on the phosphorescent sweep that painted the sky in electronic pulses. It was 22:15 hours, and for the past 10 minutes, he had watched something materializing on the screen like a ghost taking form. Not a single aircraft, not a small formation. A massive concentration of enemy bombers assembling over France. Calloway's hand reached for the telephone, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Confirmed hostile formation, bearing 270, altitude 4,000 meters, estimate 60 plus aircraft. They are forming up. At RAF Fighter Command Headquarters, Group Captain Michael Ashford received the alert with controlled urgency. He had been waiting for this call for 3 weeks, ever since Turner's fake airfield had gone operational. The Germans had taken the bait. Now came the killing stroke. Ashford lifted the red telephone that connected directly to anti-aircraft command and night fighter squadrons across southern England. Operation Mousetrap is active. All units to battle stations. Target inbound to grid reference Tango 4. Estimated time of arrival, 2,300 hours. Within minutes, air raid sirens wailed across a dozen military installations, but these were not warnings for civilians to take shelter. These sirens called hunters to their stations. Anti-aircraft crews raced to their guns, loading shells with practiced speed. Searchlight battalions powered up their massive carbon arc lamps, each one capable of throwing a beam 6 miles into the night sky. And on darkened airfields across East Anglia, pilots sprinted toward their Bristol Beaufighters, the twin-engine night fighters that had become the Luftwaffe's nightmare. Squadron leader Thomas Hartley climbed into his Beaufighter's cockpit, his radar operator, Sergeant William Price, settling into the seat behind him. Price was barely 20 years old, but his ability to read the green glow of airborne radar had made him one of the most effective operators in the squadron. Together, they had shot down 11 German bombers in 4 months. Tonight, they intended to increase that count significantly. Hartley fired the engines, feeling the Beaufighter shudder to life. Around him, 9 other aircraft did the same, their exhausts glowing blue in the darkness. The radio crackled with the ground controller's voice, calm and clinical despite the stakes. All Hellhound aircraft, you are cleared for immediate takeoff. Vector 285 after departure. Targets are multiple. I say again, targets are multiple. Good hunting. The Beaufighters roared down the runway and climbed into the black sky, their running lights extinguished, invisible predators rising to meet the approaching formation. Over the English Channel, Hauptmann Werner Brecht flew in the lead position of the Heinkel formation, his hands steady on the controls despite the cold knot of dread in his stomach. Behind him, 59 other bombers followed in tight formation, their bomb bays heavy with high explosives. The night was dark, the visibility poor, conditions that should have favored the attackers. But Brecht could not shake the feeling that they were flying into something terrible. His radio operator called out from behind. "Radio silence is holding. No signs of British fighter activity." Brecht nodded, but said nothing. The British were not fools. If they had detected the formation, they would not advertise it. They would wait, guide their night fighters into position using ground radar, and strike when the bombers were most vulnerable, committed to their attack run, focused on the target, unable to maneuver defensively. The English coast appeared ahead, a dark line against darker water. Brecht checked his instruments and began the descent toward the target altitude. Around him, the formation tightened, each pilot maintaining position through practiced discipline. In the bellies of the aircraft, bombardiers armed their payloads and prepared for the attack run. On the ground below, Colonel Turner stood at the edge of his fake airfield, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the night sky. He could hear the distant drone of approaching aircraft engines, a sound that made his blood run cold, despite knowing this was exactly what he had orchestrated. Strangeways stood beside him, silent and tense. "They are coming," Turner said quietly. "Light it up." Across the fake airfield, carefully positioned lanterns flared to life. The runway lights glowed in perfect sequence. Vehicle headlights moved along access roads. The entire installation blazed with controlled illumination, a beacon in the darkness, a target screaming to be destroyed. 5 miles to the north, Squadron Leader Hartley received the ground controller's urgent transmission. Hellhound Leader, multiple bandits bearing 290, range 12 miles, altitude 4,000. They are beginning their attack run. You are cleared to engage. Hartley pushed the throttles forward, the Beaufighter surging ahead. Behind him, Price hunched over his radar screen, watching the green blips multiply and separate as the German formation spread out for the bombing run. His voice was tight with excitement. "Contact! I have multiple contacts. Closest target, bearing 285, range 4 miles, and closing." Hartley banked hard toward the intercept vector, his eyes straining against the darkness. 4 miles. 3 miles. 2 miles. Then Price's voice, sharp and urgent. "Target directly ahead. 1 mile, same altitude. I see him on visual." Hartley saw it too. A dark shape against the stars, the distinctive silhouette of a Heinkel bomber, its engines glowing faintly. He positioned the Beaufighter directly behind and below the German aircraft, invisible in its blind spot, and reached for the firing button. The Beaufighter's 4 20mm cannons erupted, spitting tracers that tore into the Heinkel's fuselage. Sparks flew, metal shrieked. The bomber's port engine exploded in flame, and the aircraft rolled violently to the left, spiraling toward the earth, trailing fire and smoke. Hartley did not watch it fall. He was already hunting the next target. Across the night sky, the slaughter began. 10 British night fighters tore into the German formation with devastating efficiency. Ground-based radar guided them to within visual range, where their airborne radar took over, allowing them to close for the kill. The Germans, focused on reaching the target, did not realize they were being hunted until cannon fire ripped through their aircraft. Brecht saw a bomber to his right explode in midair, a brilliant flash that turned night into day for an instant. Then another bomber fell, trailing flames. His radio erupted with panicked transmissions. "We are under attack. Night fighters, break formation. They are everywhere." Brecht made the hardest decision of his career. He pulled back on the stick, breaking off the attack run, and transmitted the abort order. "All aircraft, break off and return to base. Repeat, abort mission and return to base." But breaking off did not save them. As the formation disintegrated into individual aircraft desperately trying to escape, they flew directly into the next phase of Turner's trap. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Searchlights stabbed upward, painting bombers in brilliant white light. Once illuminated, the aircraft became easy targets for the heavy guns. Shells burst around the bombers in black flowers of shrapnel. One Heinkel, caught in multiple searchlight beams, disintegrated under direct hits, its wreckage falling in burning pieces across the countryside. The night sky became a nightmare of fire, tracers, explosions, and falling aircraft. German crews who had flown dozens of missions, who had survived raids over London and Coventry, found themselves overwhelmed by a level of defensive coordination they had never encountered. The British were not just defending. They were executing. Hartley shot down his third bomber of the night, watching it spiral into a forest in a cascade of flame. His ammunition was running low, but the target-rich environment made every burst count. Price's radar showed more contacts fleeing eastward, and Hartley pursued, relentless. On the ground, Turner watched the carnage with a mixture of triumph and horror. The fake airfield remained untouched. Not a single bomb had fallen on it. The Germans had been intercepted before they could release their payloads, their formation shattered, their mission utterly destroyed. But the sky was full of dying men, and even in victory, Turner felt the weight of what he had orchestrated. By midnight, it was over. The surviving German bombers limped back toward France, their formations broken, their crews traumatized. Behind them, the night sky over England glowed with burning wreckage scattered across miles of countryside. Search and rescue teams combed the impact sites, finding few survivors. In his operations room, Group Captain Ashford tallied the preliminary results with grim satisfaction. 43 confirmed kills, 11 probables, 6 more bombers so badly damaged they likely would not reach France, against 0 British losses. Turner returned to headquarters as dawn broke, his face gray with exhaustion. Strangeways met him at the door with a decoded German transmission intercepted by Bletchley Park. It was a fragmentary distress call from one of the surviving Heinkel crews, transmitted in clear because their encryption equipment had been damaged. The message was brief and devastating. "We flew into hell. They were waiting for us." The sun rose over Saint-Omer Airfield to a scene of devastation that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. Ground crews stood in silent clusters, staring at the empty dispersal bays where 60 bombers had been parked the previous evening. Now only 17 aircraft sat on the tarmac, many so badly damaged they would never fly again. Mechanics moved between the survivors like medics on a battlefield, counting holes, assessing structural damage, finding blood in cockpits and pieces of shrapnel embedded in aluminum skin. Major Klaus Steiner walked among the wreckage in a state of shock so profound he could barely form coherent thoughts. 43 aircraft destroyed, 17 more damaged beyond immediate repair. Over 400 men dead, missing, or wounded in a single night. And for what? The fake airfield had not received a single bomb. Not one. The British had annihilated the formation before it could even reach the target. In the intelligence office, photographs from the previous day's reconnaissance still covered the walls. The fake airfield, perfect in every detail, mocked him with its plywood lies. Steiner tore the images down with shaking hands, understanding now what he should have seen before. The British had not just built a decoy. They had constructed a psychological trap, designed specifically to exploit how German intelligence analyzed targets. They had anticipated every verification step, answered every question, satisfied every concern. They had thought like Germans to deceive Germans. Oberst Hoffmann found Steiner an hour later, sitting at his desk, surrounded by torn photographs. The colonel's face was gray, aged 10 years overnight. He placed a document on Steiner's desk without speaking. It was a casualty list. Steiner recognized names. Pilots he had briefed personally. Crews he had assured that the target was legitimate and worth the risk. Hauptmann Werner Brecht was listed as missing. Last seen over the English coast trailing smoke. "They are calling you in for questioning," Hoffmann said quietly. "Berlin wants to know how this happened." Steiner nodded slowly. He knew what questioning meant. The Gestapo did not ask politely. If they decided he had been incompetent, or worse, complicit, he would not leave their headquarters alive. But what haunted him, more than fear, was the terrible certainty that he had done everything correctly, followed every protocol, verified every detail, and still been utterly fooled. It was perfect, he whispered. Every shadow, every tire track, every piece of evidence. How did they do it? Hoffmann sat down heavily. They understood us better than we understood them. That is how. Across the channel, Colonel Turner stood in the genuine RAF operations room at High Wycombe, looking at reconnaissance photographs taken at dawn over the fake airfield. The installation sat completely intact, its wooden bombers still in neat rows, its fake buildings undamaged. A bitter smile crossed his face. The Germans had been so thoroughly intercepted that not a single bomb had fallen anywhere near the target. Air Marshal Harris entered the room, his expression caught between triumph and unease. "The final count is in. 43 confirmed kills. 14 more crashed on return to France, or were written off as total losses. 57 bombers out of 60. We have crippled an entire bomber group." Turner nodded but felt no joy. He had orchestrated the deaths of hundreds of men through deception. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Those German crews would have bombed real targets, killed real civilians, destroyed real infrastructure. By dying over his fake airfield, they had saved countless lives. But the weight of the dead still pressed on him like a physical force. "There is something else," Harris continued, sliding a decoded Luftwaffe transmission across the table. "German High Command is conducting a full review of their intelligence procedures. They are questioning whether any of their reconnaissance can be trusted. Some units are refusing to attack targets that have not been personally verified by senior officers." Turner understood the implications immediately. The psychological impact of the deception would extend far beyond one night's losses. The Germans would now second-guess every target, waste time and resources verifying information, hesitate when decisive action was needed. Trust in their intelligence apparatus had been shattered. That doubt would ripple through every future operation. "We have done more than destroy bombers," Turner said softly. "We have poisoned their decision-making process." At Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin, the recriminations had already begun. Reichsmarschall Hermann G. Ring, furious at the losses and humiliated by the deception, demanded accountability. Intelligence officers were arrested. Reconnaissance procedures were suspended pending review. Planning for future bomber operations ground to a halt as every previous target assessment was questioned. The paranoia spread like infection. If the British could fake an entire airfield so convincingly, what else had they faked? Were other targets legitimate or traps? How many reconnaissance photos were showing staged deceptions rather than genuine installations? The questions multiplied without answers, and in the absence of certainty, the Luftwaffe became paralyzed by doubt. 3 weeks after the disaster, Major Steiner stood before a Gestapo tribunal in a windowless room in Berlin. They interrogated him for 14 hours, dissecting every decision, every analysis, every photograph he had examined. He answered with mechanical precision, knowing that his career and possibly his life were already forfeit. But as the interrogation wore on, something unexpected happened. The lead interrogator, an SS colonel with cold eyes and a reputation for extracting confessions, set down his papers and spoke with grudging respect. "You followed every protocol. Your analysis was thorough. The British operation was simply more sophisticated than anything we anticipated." Steiner was not executed. Instead, he was reassigned to a training facility where he would teach the next generation of photo interpreters how to identify deceptions. The irony was not lost on him. He would spend the rest of the war explaining how the British had fooled him, using his own failure as a cautionary tale. In England, Turner's fake airfield remained operational for another 4 months, maintained by skeleton crews who kept the illusion alive. The Germans never attacked it. Their reconnaissance aircraft still photographed it regularly, but no bombers came. The psychological wound was too deep. The Luftwaffe had learned to fear what appeared too perfect, too inviting, too vulnerable. By late 1943, the strategic balance had shifted. The Luftwaffe, once a fearsome offensive force, was now consumed by defensive operations and crippled by institutional doubt. Bomber losses over England had become unsustainable. Resources were diverted from offensive operations to defend against Allied bombing raids on Germany itself. Turner sat in his office one evening reading after-action reports and intelligence assessments that quantified the operation's impact. The numbers told a story of cascading failure for the Germans. Reduced bombing sorties, delayed operations, canceled missions due to target verification concerns. The fake airfield had become a legend within both intelligence communities, a case study in deception that would be analyzed for decades. But what haunted Turner was not the strategic success. It was a letter intercepted by British intelligence, written by a German pilot's widow to her sister. The pilot had died in the raid, his bomber shot down by night fighters. The widow wrote about her husband's last visit home, his unease about the mission, his sense that something was wrong. She wrote about the 2 children who would grow up without their father. And she asked a question that Turner could not answer. Why did they send him to die for nothing? Turner folded the letter carefully and placed it in a locked drawer with other documents he kept, but could not share. The mathematics of war were clear. His operation had saved lives by taking lives. It had shortened the war by exploiting human psychology and institutional procedure. It had demonstrated that perception could be as powerful as physical force. But mathematics did not account for the weight of individual deaths, for families destroyed, for the knowledge that victory required building perfect lies and watching men die for them. Turner had won a battle in the invisible war, a conflict fought with shadows and illusions rather than bullets and bombs. And like all wars, invisible or otherwise, it left scars on everyone who fought it. The fake airfield was finally dismantled in December 1943. Its wooden bombers burned, its painted runways plowed under. The field returned to farmland, and within months, grass covered the tire tracks and footpaths that had fooled an empire. But the lessons learned would echo through military doctrine for generations. Deception had proven itself not just as a tactical tool, but as a strategic weapon, capable of reshaping how enemies thought, decided, and acted. The age of modern psychological warfare had arrived, born in a field of plywood and canvas, where perception became more powerful than reality, and where the greatest victories were achieved not by destroying the enemy's forces, but by destroying their certainty.